Good morning, colleagues. I hope you can all see me and hear me. I am Dr. Indira Ramprasad, Senior Research Fellow at SALISES, and I will be your chair this morning. It is my distinct privilege to first welcome our distinguished director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Acting Director of SALISES. And of course, last but by no means least, so second but by no means least, Dr. Priya Mohan, who will be our feature speaker for today. She is the person we are spotlighting in the first of our SALISES Spotlight series for 2022. She will be speaking on the topic natural disasters and climate shocks, building economic resilience in Caribbean SIDS. And I will give you a more detailed introduction of Dr. Mohan as the proceedings go. I'd also like to welcome all of you in the audience, members of the university community, region-wide, whether it's St. Augustine, Jamaica, Mona, Cave Hill, Five Islands, or Open Campus, and members of the regional community outside of UWI. So I want to welcome all of you. I just had 2 minutes to give this welcome. So I'm going to move on directly to our distinguished director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, who will be doing the opening remarks this morning. Dr. St. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramprasad. And it is indeed a pleasure for me to sit here and begin this spotlight series that SALISES has championed over the years. And it is now going to kick off for the first time at the SALISES branch in UWI St. Augustine. So I'd like to begin by again echoing the sentiments of the chair and wish a great morning and welcome to all of the participants who are part of the virtual audience, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome you to this first installment in the SALISES UWI St. Augustine's Spotlight series. It is indeed a pleasure to start this series because what it is intended to do is to showcase the research and the variety of research topics that the fellows who are stationed here in the St. Augustine campus, SALISES UWI, it is really our intention to showcase the quality of the research and the breadth of the research that we do here in UWI St. Augustine, and in particular in the SALISES. So although I'm speaking here on behalf of SALISES St. Augustine, I have to admit that we are part of what is referred to as SALISES Regional, as there are branches on the Cave Hill campus in Barbados and on the Mona campus in Jamaica. And I earlier mentioned the Spotlight series, which has been started for quite a while because this has been a regular feature on the calendar of the Mona SALISES branch. And we in St. Augustine are now taking it up and really forging ahead with it for the first time. So we are indeed pleased to do so. SALISES, as you may have recognized over the past, has been engaged in serious activities. And since October, we have held 6 virtual SALISES forums, which have engaged a number of topical issues akin to development and sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed in Caribbean societies. And we are pleased with the kind of traction we have gained and the kind of feedback we have received with respect to those forums that we have hosted, 6 of them so far. On Friday, for that matter, this Friday the 29th of April, we will be hosting the 7th of our SALISES virtual forums. And that forum is entitled Strengthening National Statistics for Sustainable Development Through a Gendered Lens. And we have 6 panelists. The 6 panelists are Dr. Teresa Rajaktali, Dr. Leith Dunn, Dr. Philomene Harrison, Dr. Peter Weller, Dr. Asha Cambon, and Ms. Isua Iahen. These are distinguished persons, distinguished researchers, distinguished professionals who have all made substantial contributions in their specific domains, particularly focusing on gendered lenses in their insights and their interpretive nuances that they bring to bear upon issues that are akin to development, sustainable development in Caribbean society. So we are pleased on Friday, this upcoming Friday, to host this forum, the 7th in our series. We have also in the past hosted a Sixth Formers webinar on the life and work of Sir Arthur Lewis when we celebrated the birthday of Sir Arthur Lewis back in January of this year. And that series, that webinar is available online. We can send you the link and you can actually access that. Of course, we do have links for all of the forums that we have hosted so far. So this is going to be an ongoing exercise. The Spotlight series is going to be an ongoing exercise within the SALISES context, and every month you can expect to see a different SALISES scholar actually making his or her presentation relating to the work that they are doing in SALISES and focusing on development in the Caribbean, generally speaking, and in many respects, the global South. Before I stop, before I conclude this, these remarks, I want to also bring your attention to a very important event that SALISES Regional will be championing today. And as you can see, SALISES is a very busy organization because this morning we are hosting the Spotlight series. And this evening we are hosting what is termed the Sir Arthur Lewis Virtual Distinguished Lecture. That is going to be hosted by the Vice Chancellor of the UWI, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, and the distinguished lecture is going to be delivered by the CARICOM Secretary General, who is an alumnus of SALISES. She is Dr. Carla Barnett. And of course, the title of her presentation will be Sustained Economic Recovery Post-Pandemic, the Lewis Model. So she again is going to be addressing the whole idea of the works related to Sir Arthur Lewis in the context of sustained economic recovery in the post-pandemic period. So we have a packed day in terms of activities that will be hosted and championed by SALISES. And I take this opportunity to invite you to that event. It is going to begin at 6 p.m. this evening, Eastern Caribbean time, 5 p.m. Jamaica time. So I expect that some of you will be interested in this evening's proceedings as well. And you can go on our websites and you can actually find the links. In fact, during today's session that we are having at the moment, we will send you the link just in case you are interested in that event. So again, I am thankful that you have become and you are part of our virtual audience. I am hopeful that you will enjoy the presentation made today by our distinguished young scholar, Dr. Priya Mohan, and I leave it up to our chairperson, Dr. Indira Rampersad, to introduce Dr. Mohan as righteously as she will do. So at this point, thank you for joining us and do enjoy today's proceedings. We are pleased to have all of you on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. St. Bernard, for that background on the Spotlight series. I myself am quite informed now, and I hope our audiences as well. It is now my distinct privilege to put the spotlight on our feature speaker. And this is Dr. Priya Mohan, a remarkable young lady who have achieved tremendously in her short stint. And I have to say short stint, as you know, she's young, she's bright, she's beautiful. You can see that for yourself. So the spotlight will be on this lady in pink, who is a senior research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, UWE. She's a graduate of the SALISES St. Augustine, a PhD in economic development policy with high commendation. She's an applied economist, skilled in the use of sophisticated econometric methods and in data analysis more generally. She has conducted research on and is widely published on a range of topics focused on Caribbean growth and development, including climate change and natural disasters, diversification, public finance, innovation and entrepreneurship, food policy, entrepreneurship and regional development, tourism economics, ecological economics, the world economy, and energy policy. These are some of the international peer-reviewed journals Dr. Mohan has published in. She's a recipient of several research grants and awards. She's worked on various research projects funded by international bodies, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Development Research Center, and the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. She serves as a co-editor to the Island Studies Journal, an international interdisciplinary journal established by the University of Prince Edward Islands Institute of Island Studies. Dr. Mohan also teaches and supervises graduate students in a diverse range of development topics and quantitative research methodologies, and feels that it is part of her responsibility to give back to her students what she has been taught. She has presented and participated in several policy debates regionally and internationally, and she sees it as paramount to the Caribbean growth and development process to make public reasoned arguments that are supported by research and academic expertise. So colleagues, you would see when I say this is indeed a remarkable young lady. We are all very proud of her achievements. I particularly saw her blossoming as a graduate student into a graduate PhD into now a well-published scholar. So without further ado, I want to introduce and place on the spotlight our distinguished speaker, Dr. Priya Mohan. Dr. Mohan, over to you. She's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Rampersad, for that very generous introduction. I'd like to begin the presentation by thanking the SALISES and, of course, its director for the opportunity to present at this spotlight presentation. I'd also like to thank UB Marketing and the SALISES team for all of the hard work that would have gone into preparing for this presentation. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, for joining us here today. I also need to acknowledge my co-authors in advance. Their work is cited in the presentation, but I do need to acknowledge their contribution in my own research. Some of these papers are joined. I'd like to especially acknowledge Professor Eric Strobel, who is here in the audience, who I've worked with for some years now, as well as Professor Patrick Watson, who may join. So with that said, let's begin the spotlight presentation today. The title being Natural Disasters and Climate Shocks, Building Economic Resilience in Caribbean Small Island Developing States. This just gives a bit of the presentation outline, but today I will be mainly speaking on two main research areas. Firstly, I would look at the economic impacts of hurricanes in the Caribbean, following which I would speak a bit about building economic resilience in the Caribbean as I wrap up the presentation. So let's begin with asking, why should we study the Caribbean? Why should there be an interest in studying the Caribbean? The Caribbean, as we know, has been in a low growth, high debt trap for many years. The region is also characterized by a high exposure to natural disasters and climate change risk. Now, building economic resilience is important in the region if we are to create an enabling environment for climate change mitigation and adaptation and stabilization following natural disaster shocks. Why should we look at natural disasters in the Caribbean? Well, these Caribbean small island states are located in the Atlantic hurricane belt. Hurricanes are the most frequent external shocks experienced. The region is described as one of the most disaster-prone territories in the world, and it can be expected on average that 11 tropical storms would form in the Atlantic hurricane belt every year, 6 reaching hurricane strength, with 2 becoming very damaging hurricanes. The region also spends huge costs in terms of climate change. Together with Latin America, we can expect 1.5 to 5% of our GDP costs to be taken up by climate change impacts. Now, looking at the literature on the economic impact of natural disasters, while published figures on the destruction following a natural disaster are often large, there is actually ambiguity in the studies on the actual economic impact of natural disasters. Studies mainly look at the impact of disasters on GDP growth or economic growth, and studies have shown that economic growth decreases after natural disaster, giving destruction to human and physical capital. While other studies have actually concluded that growth can increase following a natural disaster. While this might seem surprising, the destruction following a natural disaster can actually stimulate a more accelerated adoption of capital and labor and new technology as we replace old technology and damaged infrastructure. And this could then lead to increased productivity and growth through technical change. Now, this contradictory evidence in the literature could be for purely empirical reasons, for instance, heterogeneity in the data, use of different natural disaster proxies, and even use of different econometric techniques. Now, this is worrying for policymakers, since it makes it difficult to identify how much of a role disaster mitigation should and could play before and after a disaster impact. Also, the appropriate policy action for either positive or negative impact arising out of these disasters can be very different. Now, a more recent strand of the literature views natural disasters as being complex, and their impacts differ based on various factors, including the economic variables being investigated. Now, these variables can include public finance, employment, banking, international trade, etc. And there's really a lack of evidence in the wider literature on the impact of disasters on these particular macroeconomic variables. And this is where my research plays a role, where one of my main research questions really is looking at what are the economic impacts of hurricanes in the Caribbean. And in doing so, I really seek to contribute to the literature by providing more reliable estimates of the economic impact of natural disasters. Now, one might ask why the focus on hurricanes? Well, different types of disasters have different potential negative effects. And of course, hurricanes are the most frequent external shocks experienced in our region. Also, why focus on the Caribbean? Well, the destruction of natural disasters differ by countries because of differences in their level of economic development, their institutional frameworks, their risk-sharing mechanisms, and their level of preparedness. And of course, I am from the Caribbean, so I do have a natural interest in studying the region. The research also seeks to employ more scientifically based proxies of the potential destruction from hurricanes. And it does this by estimating the actual severity of wind speeds experienced at detailed geographic levels, which are then translated into a potential destructiveness index. Now, why do this? Because what is located where a hurricane strikes and where a hurricane strikes actually affects the impact of the destruction. Also, my research has been seeking to use more high frequency data since natural disaster impacts are immediate, and the use of more high frequency data allows us to capture these types of immediate impacts. So this slide just sort of gives some of the data sources for the macroeconomic variables used in the research, as well as the sources of data for the hurricane destruction and climate variables, including rainfall and temperature. And here we see some of the methodologies involved, which we do not, unfortunately, have time to get into the details for the purposes of this presentation. So what I do next, I take you through a series of studies that I would have done, again, with my co-authors, where I would share with you some of the main results and highlight the policy implications coming out of this research. Again, these studies seek, as I said in the beginning, to determine more precisely the economic impacts of hurricanes in the Caribbean. And the first study here actually looks at the impact of hurricanes on the components of GDP. What we seek to find out here, we try to look at the actual impact on GDP from hurricanes in the Caribbean by looking at how the various components are affected. And the results actually show that there is a slight initial increase in GDP in the region after a hurricane, which is then followed by a decrease of 2.4 percentage points, and then a further decrease of 0.4 percentage points. And we see that the components driving this change would be that exports actually decrease 2 years after a hurricane. We have imports initially increasing, then decreasing. We have investments immediately increasing, then decreasing. We see government consumption increase in the year of a hurricane. And then we see private consumption decrease for up to 3 years after. Now, the policy implication here would be that policymakers should really consider all the components of GDP, since these components are not affected uniformly by natural disaster. And one policy implication may actually have a positive impact on one component, but it can also have a negative impact on another. More importantly, we see here that we really need to try to sustain government consumption expenditure following these disaster strikes, as well as investments. And we need to support our exports if we are to really go on a positive GDP growth path following these disaster events. Next, looking at production efficiency, which is really the way we combine our factors of production, capital, and labor to create output. We found that hurricanes do actually have a positive impact on production efficiency in the region. We found that efficiency actually increased by just 0.4% for the average storm, and this would have been driven by the cleanup and reconstruction activities following these disaster impacts. We also found that the rainfall and temperature variables had no impact on production efficiency. Now, the policy implication here being that governments should really have a well-planned strategy for spending after these disaster strikes if they are to achieve maximum production efficiency following these hazardous events. Now, looking at one aspect of our input into production employment, we've actually found that hurricanes have had a downward impact on unemployment by about 13%, with lag impacts of up to 4 years. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because we're saying that employment actually increases after a hurricane in the Caribbean. But what we've really found when we look further into the data is that the actual labor force participation rate declines after a hurricane. So persons actually drop out of the workforce when these events happen in the Caribbean. We've also found that there's really little difference in impact on males versus females, as well as male youth. However, we've seen more severe negative impacts of female youth across the region. We've also found that labor legislation and employment benefits do provide some mitigating impacts following these events. And the policy implication being here is that these results really highlight the importance of an employment-centered recovery following natural disaster events. Cleanup and recovery can really act as strong drivers for job creation and the reduction of inequalities and skills gaps if we ensure that no one is left behind and everyone is really included. Now, looking at public debt, why look at debt? Because we are a region of high debt, and of course, natural disaster events are one of the factors driving our increasing debt in the region. And the research actually does show that hurricanes do increase government debt in the Caribbean. We found that for the average hurricane, the debt to GDP ratio can increase by 8.1%. And that debt to GDP ratio can actually increase by as much as 132% for the most damaging storms. More worrying is that this debt comes with lag impacts of up to 3 quarters after the event and more permanent effects of up to 2 years after the event. So when a hurricane strikes, we can see an accumulation of debt for up to 2 years after this event has actually occurred. What we've also found is that different components of debt are affected differently, and that governments in the region tend to rely on external debt rather than accumulating debt domestically. The policy implications here being that we can expect debt to rise after these disaster events. So what we should attempt to do is keep debt levels at a sustainable level by really creating that fiscal space to finance the recovery. We need to ensure that financing is available immediately after the disaster occurs, because that's when it's most critical that we tap into liquidity. Also, we can learn that maybe we can tap more into our internal sources of borrowing, which would place a less strain on our foreign exchange reserves in the region, given that we do face, all of us across the islands do face issues of shortages with our foreign exchange. Now looking at the other side of debt, the tax revenue, how do we actually finance the recovery? We actually see that hurricanes do actually cause a loss in tax revenue by an average of 5.3%. We've also found that the different components of the tax revenue are affected differently. Revenue from international trade and transactions and revenue from domestic goods and services are most negatively affected after a hurricane strikes. We've also found that countries with higher value added tax, international trade tax, and transaction tax are actually better able to buffer the negative impacts of these hurricane events. So the policy implication here being that governments may want to improve their tax efficiency and increase their tax base from income and profits and imported and exported goods, particularly after these hurricane events. Now, in terms of policy making, across various sectors, we may need to be sector specific in our prescriptions. So the research has also attempted to look at the impact of hurricanes across various sectors in the Caribbean. One sector being the banking sector, given that the banking sector plays an important role in financing recovery following these events. And what the results show actually is that following a hurricane, banks face deposit withdrawals. As households finance their recovery, they rely on their deposits, which cause these banks to face a deposit withdrawal. And as these banks experience this deposit withdrawals, they respond by reducing their supply of credit and drawing on their liquid assets. Now, we've found a decrease in the growth of total deposits by 2.9 percentage points for up to 2 quarters after hurricane event, and a 1.76 percentage point decrease in total other liabilities. Now, the story we're telling here is that in financing our recovery after a hurricane event, there's a reliance on the use of deposits rather than banks actually extending credit to households in financing our post-hurricane recovery. Now, the policy implication being that there is importance in maintaining an active reserve requirement policy if we are to control liquidity after these events. Now, looking at the agricultural sector, this is a sector that is particularly vulnerable to hurricane events. It's also a sector that plays an important role in contributing to GDP, especially in our smaller Caribbean countries. And what we found is that hurricanes actually do have a negative impact on the agricultural sector in the actual year of the event and also 1 year after, with an average reduction of 80% of agricultural production. Now, what we've also found is that there is significant heterogeneity across the different types of crops. So different crops are actually affected differently by these hurricane strikes in the Caribbean. So for instance, we found that bananas and nutmegs are particularly negatively affected compared to, let's say, our root crops. We've also found heterogeneity in terms of the impacts on the actual islands, in that in the smaller islands, agriculture can actually be completely wiped out by these natural disaster strikes, while in the larger islands, the reduction in agriculture is not as severe. Now, the policy implications here being that a diversification program within the agricultural sector is necessary, as well as the promotion of hurricane-resistant crops across the region, as well as the construction of proper storage, processing, preservation, and preparation facilities for crops that can actually be harvested and stored. And finally, in terms of the economic impacts of hurricanes, one final study here looks at the tourism sector. Again, because tourism is an important sector in the Caribbean. And what we've looked at here is actually the impact of hurricanes on cruise ship arrivals versus air arrivals. And what we've seen here is that the impact of hurricanes on cruise ship arrivals is actually much more severe compared to air arrivals. We see that a hurricane can cause a decline of 2.33 percentage point in the month of a strike and 1.21 percentage point 1 month after for cruise ship arrivals. The same figures for airplane arrivals show a decline of just 0.57 percentage points in the month of a strike and 0.27 percentage point 1 month after. The results also show that a strong recovery in airplane arrivals, some 3 to 6 months following a hurricane event, could actually offset the negative impact on the cruise ship sector by around 2 percentage points. The policy implication here being that, of course, different types of tourists are affected differently by hurricane strikes. So it's important that we distinguish between our different tourist markets, and it's important that we try to actively attract more air arrivals following natural disaster strikes. Now, naturally, after discussing all of those impacts of hurricane strikes in the Caribbean, one can ask, well, how do we build economic resilience in the Caribbean going forward? Given that we can expect that these hurricane strikes are going to occur ever so frequent. Now, I must admit that this is part of my research that is not as well developed as what I presented earlier in terms of looking at the macroeconomic impacts. So what I'm going to discuss now is really some of my future research ideas and some work that I'm currently working on. So the question really is, how do we build economic resilience in the region following these sort of negative external shocks? And how do we do that? Well, if we look into the literature, we see that there are various strategies around building economic resilience. The first one being green growth. Now, why a green growth recovery? Well, a green growth fights climate change. It helps us to better manage our natural capital. It helps to protect the environment. It helps to diversify and create new green jobs. It helps in attracting private sector investment. It helps in attracting international climate finance. And of course, it helps with achieving sustainable development. Now, green growth means greening the entire value chain from our inputs, production, outputs, and consumption. It's also going to involve changes to our taxes and subsidies and our regulations, our investment, innovation, and trade ecosystems. and of course, our education and training systems. Another area for building economic resilience in the Caribbean will be looking at the blue economy. Why the blue economy? Well, ocean resources are on average more than 2,000 times the land size of small island economies. Coastal tourism and fisheries are already an important source of foreign exchange and employment in most of these economies. There's also an increase in demand for ocean-based economic activities, and this is driven by a growing need for energy, food, and jobs from the ocean, and a growing global population. The blue economy is also essential in our fight against climate change. Now, creating a blue economy, developing a blue economy in the Caribbean involves conserving and restoring the ocean, sustainable and traceable seafood, sustainable tourism, curbing ocean pollution from land, greening of ports, shipping, and maritime transport, and of course, harnessing renewable energy from ocean energy. Another strategy for building resilience in the Caribbean is innovation and digital transformation. Now, connecting the world means connecting the Caribbean as well. There should be an introduction or expansion of digital services in education, agriculture, health, etc. As we've seen very recently by COVID-19, these changes are being driven strongly. But there are challenges that we face as small island economies in that we do have small domestic markets, a small number of ICT suppliers, limited access to reliable connectivity, high costs, issues of digital literacy, lack of awareness of the advantages, and lack of relevant local content online, and of course, cybersecurity issues. Nonetheless, in building a digital transformation for good, we can focus on e-networks for sharing, e-commerce for connecting, small businesses online internationally, and building digital entrepreneurship so that we can more fully enhance our entrepreneurial potential in the region. And building on that, we should seek to really develop our small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurship as we seek to build resilience in the Caribbean. Now, the SME sector contributes significantly to growth and employment in the Caribbean, but SMEs in small island economies do face more severe constraints in that they face a small market size, high transport costs, limited linkages to the formal economy, a lack of skilled labor, lack of business know-how, limited access to finance, and geographic isolation. SMEs are, however, known to adapt to different contexts and user needs, respond to new and niche markets, and they accept a higher level of risk generally. Now, this gives them greater flexibility and a competitive advantage in actually bringing new ideas to the market. And SMEs have been doing so more and more as they integrate more digital practices and tools since COVID-19. Of course, they do face barriers in terms of using technology, data, information, and networks, and accessing all of the resources around this to help them better contribute to the economic output of the region. Now, let's talk a little bit about climate finance. In financing any recovery or building any resilience, finance is important. And an important issue in finance now is the issue of climate finance. Now, climate-related funding to small island developing states make up just 2.2% of total climate funds. This is despite the fact that small island developing states are on the front line of climate change, and that small island developing states actually contribute 0.01% of global greenhouse gases globally. Now, of course, there are challenges to accessing climate finance. We do face complex requirements and processes in writing these grants and accessing these climate finance. We do face limitations in terms of our institutional and policy support and human resources when applying for these grants. Now, the Caribbean also faces the issue of not being eligible for concessional financing because of our high income status. However, out there are several climate finance funds that we can tap into as we seek to build resilience in the region, including the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, etc. Also, in terms of building resilience to climate change impacts, an important sector that we fail to look at in the region is actually the private sector. The private sector can actually contribute significantly to climate finance and building resilience in the region. And of course, there are a host of financial innovations that can also help, including debt for climate swaps, green bonds, blue bonds, gender bonds, etc. Now I'm going to begin to wrap up. This is the last slide and the last point that I'll make. In terms of building resilience, it's important for goal setting and development planning. And what exactly do I mean by this? Well, the SDGs can actually be used as a framework for building resilience. Policymakers are increasingly seeing value in scaling of action and commitment around these goals as we build more resilient economies and societies. Now, policy coherence is needed to balance our short-term economic growth objectives with our long-term sustainability and resilience goals. And of course, in this goal setting and development planning approach, there are several elements that do make it a success. It does require political commitment, long-term vision, policy integration, policy coordination, local investment, stakeholder engagement, policy impacts, and monitoring and reporting. So I thank you here. This brings me to the end of my formal presentation, and I look forward to engaging with you with the question and answer segment.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mohan. That has been quite a mouthful. And I've learned a lot. I mean, in this little presentation, I've learned a lot. It's not exactly my field, but I am sure the audience have a lot of questions as well. So we're looking, Dr. Mohan, that was really truly excellent. I'm seeing the comments coming in. Excellent presentation, great presentation, and also enlightening and informative. You know, you brought in information. You know, one would think that nobody doing this kind of research. I heard, you know, the impact on income tax, on revenue and taxation, and the impact on economics on the whole. It's interesting information coming through with hurricanes and climate change, natural disasters. Yesterday we had a flash flooding. I heard you talk about the cruise ships. A lot of the planes were not able to land at the time we had that heavy rainfall yesterday. So, you know, I think your research will extend into all these kinds of things, and flash flooding would seem to be a problem emerging, at least in Trinidad now. So I would now open up the floor to questions. So let me see if I can get the first one first. Okay. Let me see. We have Justice Gafoor, who's commending Dr. Mohan on an excellent presentation, and also SALISES St. Augustine for this forum. He has a question, and this is the chairman of the Tax Appeal Court of Trinidad and Tobago. So he's saying, my question are as follows: is it possible to identify what particular products are more likely to be impacted by tax policy in the aftermath of a natural disaster? That's one question. And I would pose two at the same time, Dr. Mohan. I hope you would be able to answer. So he's asking about the products that would be impacted by the hurricanes. And given the combined impact of both natural disasters and the recent pandemic, what strategies would you advance for regional governments to implement in the medium to long term? Thank you, Dr. Mohan.
Thank you for those questions. For Justice Gafoor, well, we didn't actually study the tax revenue from particular products, but actually from different categories of taxation. But in terms of combining some of the research, I can probably try to answer the question in terms of combining the research from the impact of hurricanes on taxation, and of course looking at different sectors where we looked at agriculture and tourism. Now, what the study on tax revenue showed is that actually taxes from exports would be what would face a negative impact, as well as our taxes from imported goods. So this could lead one to conclude, given vulnerability in the agricultural sector and that sector creating a large volume of our exports, we can see that maybe the products in agriculture will be negatively affected. So let's say bananas and nutmeg from the Eastern Caribbean, these types of primary agricultural products would be highly negatively affected, and of course the tax revenue expected to be collected. Now that particular paper didn't actually look at service exports, but again, tourism is one of those sectors we see heavily impacted by hurricanes in the region. And of course, the tourism sector is one that really touches on across a whole range of products in an economy. So we can see directly and indirectly taxation from a whole host of services and products attached to that tourism sector really being impacted negatively by these external shocks. So I hope that sort of answers the question. In terms of the second question, I believe it was what governments can do in the more medium to short term in terms of dealing with these types of negative external shocks. And it was sort of
long term. Given the combined impact of both natural disasters and the recent pandemic, what strategies would you advance for regional governments to implement in the medium to long term?
Okay, good. So, well, let's begin with more immediate. Let's talk about what can happen now, because the more long term would really revolve around a coherent strategy around those strategies I spoke about, including green growth, the blue economy, climate finance, innovation, entrepreneurship, digitalization, and development planning. But if we talk in terms of the more short to medium term, and if we think of COVID-19 as the example of our recent external shock, I would say that policy implications for the government being that we should hold on to lessons that would have come out from the pandemic. And one that I feel very strongly about revolves around the education sector, and in terms of children being brought back into schools physically, and being, well, in Trinidad and Tobago, I'm talking about in particular, where we've now have all children coming back out to school. I think it's important that we understand that following the shock of COVID-19, we're not going back to business as usual, but we need to really live in the new normal. And the future is really a sort of hybrid model. And I think that some children were more or better adapted to learning online and maybe physically, although there were some children being excluded in that modality. But what I'm saying briefly, I'm just making the point that we should really hold on to the solutions that digital technology can provide, and hold that going forward and not get rid of it as we come out of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much, Priya. We have Mr. Jwala Rambaran, who was the former governor of the central bank. He says, excellent presentation, Dr. Mohan. Can you comment on the role of climate disaster risk finance and insurance, Cdrfi solutions, in helping to build greater resilience in Caribbean SIDS? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that question. I'm not familiar with the particular Cdrfi he's speaking about, but I am familiar with the CCRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. So I can speak generally about the issue of insurance following disaster strikes. Now, the research has quite clearly showed that the impacts of disasters are immediate, the harmful impacts are immediate, and there is a need for an immediate requirement of liquidity following these disaster events. Now, small island developing economies, Caribbean small island developing economies in particular, because we are now classified as high income, most of us, there is a limited access to aid and concessional financing. So but we do need that immediate boost in liquidity following these disaster impacts. And disaster risk insurance is certainly one way in which we can tap into that much needed liquidity. Now, I do always like to draw on the CCRIF as the first parametric insurance scheme to be developed right here in the Caribbean. And what the CRIF does is it actually provides immediate liquidity to Caribbean islands affected by these natural disaster strikes, whether it's hurricanes, flooding, etc. And it's really based on an index of the damage that would have been sustained. And the aid is not the aid, sorry, the payout is actually received in quite a timely manner so that governments are actually able to finance their recovery.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question from Nyron Seaton. Good morning, Dr. Mohan. Great presentation. Do you see an expanded role for the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility? Again, the CCRIF comes up. If so, how effective has this facility been?
I would say that the facility has been effective, but as with everything, there is room for improvement. Now, initially, when the CCRIF started, it was a facility where governments would put in money and receive the payout. So it's good for governments to have insurance and be able to access that kind of financing to finance the recovery of their countries. But I want to draw some attention to the actual households that are affected and even businesses by these disaster impacts. In one of the studies, we saw that private consumption expenditure, which is really household expenditure, could decrease some 3 years after a natural disaster event. And we also saw that investment expenditure actually decreases after these disaster events. So that sort of insurance for households and businesses is an important move. So not just governments having access to natural disaster insurance, but businesses and households. But of course, the business of insurance and insuring natural disasters is a risky one. And it's one that, private sector companies are not likely to take up because the risk is just too high. We do experience at least 2 very damaging natural hurricane strikes per year. Now, the CCRIF has been developing more innovative products in that they're moving away from governments to actual households and businesses. And one product being the insurance made available to fishermen. So this is a particularly vulnerable group that you would not expect an insurance provider to provide insurance for. But through the CRIF, they've actually been able to provide insurance to fishermen if they're adversely affected by natural disaster events. And these are really the types of solutions we require in terms of building resilience at the individual level, in terms of helping to finance recovery and ensuring that the most vulnerable groups are taken care of after these disaster events.
Okay, another question coming in from Hedy Tenia. Thanks for the contribution. How possible is it to make changes when we are dealing with cultural practices in terms of agriculture and housing? I think this is a policy question. How possible is it to make changes when we are dealing with cultural practices in terms of agriculture and housing? So I'm not sure of the relationship to the topic, but maybe you can discern the link.
Yeah, thank you, Tani. I will try to assume answering it from the perspective of cultural practices in terms of farming practices and household building and being affected by natural disaster events and culture around that. Now, I'm going to make a comparison here with Trinidad and Tobago and the other Caribbean countries. because we in Trinidad and Tobago, we're fortunate in that we're in the lower part of the hurricane belt. So we are not as frequently affected by a hurricane strike as other Caribbean islands. Now, we've been experiencing a lot of flooding recently, however, but the actual occurrence of hurricane event in Trinidad and Tobago is less likely than, let's say, in other Caribbean islands. And this is why I bring up the issue of the culture, because the culture in these other islands actually is one of resilience and one of being used to these events occurring. So I did bring up in terms of the results from the agricultural sector of the bananas being can be completely wiped out. So what happens in a small Eastern Caribbean country where all of your banana crops are actually wiped out? Well, these countries have learned to adapt, and they've actually moving away more and more from bananas, not just because of hurricanes, but also with trade agreements, etc. But they're doing more and more root crops. And that it's not necessarily new, because there is a culture of us knowing that these hurricanes are going to strike and adjusting our practices so that we do take into account these strikes. And they have found that these root crops actually do provide higher income and they're not negatively affected. In the same manner, in terms of building their houses, they do take into account that a hurricane is going to strike. It's more than likely that that house is going to be affected by a hurricane. This is something that we in Trinidad and Tobago don't necessarily take into account, bringing it back in terms of the culture. But in these other smaller Caribbean islands, they do build with hurricanes in mind. And there is that culture of being affected by these storms and that kind of building resilience and within their psyche that, you know, these events are going to happen and we need to be prepared for them.
Okay, thank you. Julian Prescott, I believe last name doesn't come out clearly, but he says, great presentation, very informative. My question, to what extent is the recovery linked to type of economy? That is, most of these economies impacted by a hurricane are tourism-based economies. Type of economy. So it's questioning on the recovery, to what extent is this linked to type of economy, since most of these economies impacted by a hurricane are tourism-based economies.
So I'll try to extrapolate a bit. I don't know, in terms of making a comparison. So I don't know if he's meaning that maybe the service-based economies that are more tourism-oriented versus the primary export type economies like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Guyana. Well, Guyana not so much affected by hurricanes. In terms of that kind of difference. Now, in general, the literature does show that service type economies are generally more resilient to external shocks, natural disaster impacts, and hurricanes compared to, let's say, a commodity producer. So let's say agriculture versus tourism. Now, that is still dangerous to say because in the Caribbean, when that service sector is only tourism, most of the facilities are actually located on the coast, and the coast would sustain the majority of the damage. So building resilience around, how do we build resilience around these types of tourism economies versus our primary sector economies? I think the point I'm trying to make is that the sectors in the Caribbean are, whether we're tourism oriented or agriculture export oriented, we are still highly vulnerable to the impact of these hurricane events. But the research, my own research that I presented has shown that, you know, there is heterogeneity in these impacts. So for instance, with the tourism example, we saw that the airplane arrivals were actually much more resilient than the cruise ship arrivals. And we saw that an active policy targeting the air arrivals could help in the recovery. Similarly, the research on agriculture showed that there are actually certain types of crops that can help build resilience in the sense that they are not negatively impacted, so incomes and households are more protected. So there are nuances and heterogeneity in the results that we need to really focus our research on and pull out these types of lessons going forward if we are, to build resilience and increase growth and development in our economies.
Thanks for that. The other question is one that I also had, and it pertains to methodology, because I found the information, some information, like I said, insightful, probably rare. So I wanted to ask the same question that Georgina Alcantara is asking. Georgina says, thanks for that presentation, Dr. Mohan. I want to ask you about your experience looking for data for this kind of analysis. Which were the main challenges, or what were the main challenges to get them? So in other words, the methodological challenges that you had in gleaning the data.
So the issue of data in the Caribbean is always a contentious one. As a researcher, we always, we always have this feeling that we don't have the data to do the research. Well, that is true to an extent. That slide I actually showed with the sources of data. Most of that data is actually freely and publicly available online. So you'd see that a lot of the macroeconomic variables, the data came from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank website. It came from the World Pen Tables, World Development Indicators. These are freely downloadable databases that all researchers can access. Also, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, there was some small payment there, but again, this is a Caribbean-based institution that would collect this type of tourism data. So it's a bit of, speaking about the macroeconomic variables, it's a bit of having an idea of what's out there and where to go to find the data. It is available, but it can take some time to find the data. And, networking and attending these types of events can help point you in the direction of the data sets being available. In terms of the hurricane data sources, well, the hurricane track data comes from the National Hurricane Center, again available to researchers. The climate variable comes from various sort of satellite type databases, which are available online. So more and more you would see that there is a move away from just relying on data from, let's say, our traditional statistical offices, and a reliance on crowdsourced data, big data, satellite type data. And these types of data sets are available online, and they can be accessed by students. If there's a particular data set that you would like to find out about, of course, you can always email me, and I can help you in terms of locating that data.
Thank you. Just a commendation from Desmond Perry. Excellent presentation, Dr. Mohan, very informative. And our director, Dr. St. Bernard, says, thanks, Dr. Mohan, expertly delivered. His question is, in terms of gauging economic fallout due to climate events, and especially hurricanes, are there areas where statistical data gathering challenges can be improved? If so, what are these areas, and what suggestions do you have with respect to statistical data collection initiatives? Any ideas for real-time big data?
So thanks, Dr. Sindana. That kind of leverages off the last point I made. So more and more research is looking to big data. And I did make the point in the presentation that the impact of these disaster events are quite immediate. So the more high frequency the data, the better we're actually able to capture the negative impacts or positive from these events. Also, I made the point that there is a spatial aspect to the damage sustained in that what is located where the disaster occurs and where the disaster occurs affects the damage. And that leads to the issue of big data and use of satellite data. So there are a lot of papers, including in some of my own joint work, where nightlight data, for instance, is actually used as a proxy for GDP. Now, this nightlight data is available, you know, at a fairly high frequency. It's a satellite that goes around and picks up nightlight imagery. So there are issues around it in terms of how accurately it's representing GDP, etc. But more and more, this type of satellite data is being accepted as useful in economic research. In terms of other big data sources, we see crowdsourced data playing more and more of a role in terms of natural disasters. So we see things like Facebook Data for Good, etc., where persons can report what has happened to them following a disaster event. And as these types of tools become more and more available, we can only use this type of data more and more to help answer the right questions for policymakers.
Okay, another question from Mr. Dwala Rambaran. Based on your extensive research on natural disasters in the Caribbean, any lessons for Dominica, which aims to become the world's first climate resilient nation?
I think Dominica has a lot of lessons for us. I think we should really be taking the lead from Dominica. I applaud the country for all of the good work that they have been doing. I myself have not been personally involved in terms of any of the work into those reports, but I do know that they have been very progressive, not just in terms of the climate front, but in terms of gender and vulnerable people. So we're talking about climate and natural disasters, but I don't want us to lose sight of persons and vulnerable communities, because these are the groups of people that are actually affected by these types of disaster events. And the government of Dominica has actually produced a gender roadmap in terms of building climate resilience. And so I think that these are important lessons for us. In terms of building climate resilience, we should not, no one should be left behind, and vulnerable groups should be considered.
Okay, we have a comment from Frank Edward Paco. Quite informative indeed. Many thanks for sharing your research. And Hedy Tenya, thanks for the response to my question. It was answered for me. Trinidad can learn from others and actively apply such learning. And Lisa Gordon says, hi, Dr. Mohan. I really enjoyed your very informative presentation. You suggested that SIDS source loans internally rather than externally to address the negative impacts of natural disasters. How do you suggest that this be done, especially within a context where CARICOM, I suppose, a lending institution, are not adequately developed and may not have the requisite financing to issue loans?
So I can't speak to the CARICOM level because I don't think the systems are actually in place for that. But just speaking at the country level, in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, there is a lot of liquidity in the system. So why not make use of it? So we face the issue of foreign exchange reserves being on decline. And we do have the need for borrowing because of various external shocks that we have faced internally. So why not tap into our, internal markets? How do you do this? Well, perhaps through a bond. you encourage citizens, to invest in their country, and this way you can mop up some of that liquidity. In terms of this being a regional initiative, well, I think we're still a far way from taking that step. But at the country level, if we start making those steps, then maybe later on we can think about it on a regional level.
Okay, so I think that's about it. The director has put something on the chat showing the links above for previous SALISES virtual forums. So those of you who want to access those, we're still open to questions. We still have a little time. If there anyone else who wants to ask a question, any other question? So if not, then all that is left for me to do is to thank everyone. And there are some people I would like to say special thanks to, of course, of the distinguished presenter, Dr. Priya Mohan. Thank you so much. I think you've addressed the questions, did a phenomenal job in attempting to address those questions. I hope that those who are seeking answers are satisfied. So Dr. Mohan, also an excellent presentation, a phenomenal job. I want to thank you very, very much for that and the time and effort placed in preparation of that presentation. I want you to keep up the good work, excellent research. The region needs it. It's in dire need of this kind of research because the future is in the hands of people like you to help us get out of some of the rut we are in with respect to natural disasters and climate change. I also want to thank our director. I will pass on to him to close shortly, but to Dr. St. Bernard for organizing and to his organizing team. And there are many, Mrs. Frances Aline, Administrative Officer. We have Kathy Ann Modest. We have Duzanne Green, marketing, the personnel from marketing. The whole SALISES team that have been involved. If there's anyone whose name I didn't mention, I want to say thank you very much for putting this forum together. And if we have members of the media, I want to thank you as well for attending. We always do get some comments from the media and from social media. So we hope to keep that going. We try to put up these presentations on YouTube if possible. So I don't know if that is in the making, but I hope it is, so that we can keep the discourse alive and current for those who want to access it and who couldn't have access to it live. Also want to thank you, our audience. Excellent questions, I have to say, which show that you had our rapt attention. Dr. Mohan really kept you interested. So I want to thank you. We have some distinguished guests, the chairman of the Tax Appeal Court, Justice Anthony Gafoor, former governor of the Central Bank. And I mean, you're all distinguished in your own right. So I want to thank all of you for attending. I will now pass on to our director. But before I do that, I want to remind you of our distinguished lecture this evening, Sir Arthur Lewis Virtual Distinguished Lecture. It is hosted by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. The title of that forum is Sustained Economic Recovery Post-Pandemic, the Lewis Model. So you can see why Sir Arthur Lewis Institute is so interested in this. The lecture will be delivered by CARICOM Secretary General, a brand new CARICOM Secretary General we have, Dr. Carla Barnett, and it will be chaired by our own University Director of SALISES, Professor Audrey Henry Lee. She's a University Director. You can tune in via www.uitv.org. So you can tune in via that, but sometimes people go to the TV thinking they can get it on channel 1 or 2 flow, but it's not always possible. I don't know if it will be today, but you have to go to the internet. You definitely will get it in your computer through it via online, www.uitv.org or www.facebook.com/UETV. So UETV is also being it through Facebook. So that promises to be very interesting, I think, because we are now looking at the post-pandemic era. It's not yet over. Some say we are in endemic, some say we are still in pandemic. You know, I traveled recently and nowhere in the US, I visited 3 cities. Nowhere were they wearing masks really. It was like business as usual. The planes were all full, cramped to capacity. So one didn't think that one was in a pandemic, but this doesn't mean that, you know, you have to become complacent or drop the mask, so to speak. So want to continue to ask you to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay at home as much as possible. We still have a high rate here, over 400 cases. I saw an outbreak in the schools. You know, 92 students contracting it. I'm not sure which schools. So we have to still continue to be careful and not to become complacent and careless. So colleagues, with that, I want to now pass you on to our distinguished director, acting director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, to close the forum. Dr. Bernard, your closing remarks. St. Bernard, sorry.
Yeah. It gives me great pleasure to bring this forum, this first installment of the SALISES Spotlight series in St. Augustine. It gives me great pleasure to bring it to an end, and I must say that it was a really outstanding feast in terms of the high level of scholarship delivered by our feature speaker, Dr. Priya Mohan, and especially her handling of the questions which came from the virtual audience. So I don't think I want to pursue this segment of the engagement any longer. I think we have had a worthy period of exchanges between our feature speaker and the virtual audience. I want in particular to extend my heartfelt thanks to our chairperson, Dr. Indira Ramprasad, for graciously agreeing to chair this morning's proceedings, and she did so expertly. I must say, I am extremely pleased with her handling of the events, and I am extremely pleased with the delivery by our feature speaker, Dr. Priya Mohan, and how the proceedings went today. Of course, the feedback online has been overwhelmingly positive. We are extremely happy about that in SALISES St. Augustine, and by extension, SALISES Regional. And I would like to thank all who were in attendance. I note in particular the presence of our university director, Professor Audrey Henry Lee. She was present, and I also noted other persons such as Justice Dr. Anthony Gafour, as well as the former governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Jawala Rambaran. And also I have seen among the list of participants other distinguished personalities, including Ambassador Richard Bernal, who is attached to SALISES UNA on the UE campus. So it is with great pleasure that I bring these proceedings to a close, and I ask you to look forward to our next installment of the Spotlight series sometime in the near future, when we will feature the research of another scholar, another researcher within our SALISES family in St. Augustine. So at this point, I want to wish all of you a wonderful day. And please do not forget that this evening, SALISES Regional is championing the work again of Sir Arthur Lewis, and you already heard about the distinguished lecture that is going to be delivered by Dr. Carla Barnett, CARICOM Secretary General. And of course, on Friday, we in SALISES will be hosting our 7th installment of our virtual SALISES forum entitled Strengthening National Statistics for Sustainable Development Through Gendered Lenses. So at this point, thank you very much. Have a good day, all of you, and continue to be safe wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. Professor Audrey Lee, my apologies. I did not realize you were in the audience. I couldn't see the list of participants. Welcome, and nice having you here. We look forward to seeing you this afternoon. this evening. Colleagues, the forum this evening starts at 6 p.m. So you can tune in uitv.org and Facebook. Goodbye, everyone, and hope you have a pleasant afternoon.